All right, hi everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So today we'll be talking about model testing. This will be a pretty quick lesson, but hopefully will give you a chance to add a little bit to Task Manager and get some practice writing model tests specifically in RSpec. Hopefully most of the syntax is pretty familiar for everybody since you're still learning RSpec in Mod 1. Is that right? Thumbs up if y'all did RSpec. Great. I think you all are the second cohort to learn RSpec in Mod 1 instead of Minitest. So I think that sets you up to almost have a head start on some of the Mod 2 content. So we'll do this model testing lesson. There'll be a little bit of time for questions and practice at the end, and then we'll roll into our first project kickoff after that. Cool. So just a few things to talk about before we get into how model tests are written in Rails. When we're thinking about models in general, just in the context of texting, but in testing, but thinking about what models do in our apps. These are what connects us to our database. So models are the piece of the model view controller pattern that I mentioned earlier in our intro to the mod. The models are the piece that have to do with data and records and things that are stored and updated and retrieved and all that good stuff. So because of this, we really can't afford to have any errors in our data, and we can't afford to have logic that is going wrong or bugs happening or anything like that. So that could look like a variety of things. It could incorrectly calculate a grand total price for an order, for example. That would be behavior that we would want to have we would want it to be very well tested to make sure that error didn't happen. That would have bad implications for our business applications. Model tests should fully cover our models. So if there is behavior written on a model in our application, we need to test it. And we need to be sure to test every edge case that we can think of when it comes to models. So this might start sounding familiar, and we can think of model tests as very similar to the kinds of things you were writing in the kinds of tests you were writing in Mod 1. We should also be testing relationships between different models, and we will get into more details about what that looks like as the week goes on, as well as validation. So if we are creating a model in our database and it needs to have something in the name field, that is behavior that we would want to test at the model level. Any custom behavior that we create on a model, such as our example of being able to calculate a grand total price for an order. Maybe we have an order model and it has a grand total price method that we have to write ourselves. That would be something that we would want to test. And like I mentioned, we would want to include any and all edge cases that we can think of. So another example that we could look at is if we have an artist model, we're creating an application where we store artists and we store songs, and the artist model should have an average song length method that we are defining ourselves. What would that method return if the artist doesn't have any songs at all? So that would be an example of an edge case we could test at the model level. And then there's another point here about SimpleCov. I will try to circle back to this in our examples in the text editor, but you can check your model coverage by running RSpec spec models and then opening the coverage index HTML file. This is different than the output that you'll get from SimpleCov after running RSpec. Just a note here that we will try to reemphasize throughout the mod that you need to remember to run specifically RSpec spec models to see the coverage reflected for your model tests. Did you all work with SimpleCov in Mod 1 at all? Okay, I see some nods. That's great. So this should be somewhat familiar, I hope. That being said, 100% coverage on SimpleCov doesn't necessarily mean that your models are fully covered. We definitely need to use our human brains as well as referencing our SimpleCov coverage percentage to think of things like sad paths or edge cases, which we'll of course talk about in more detail. Marla?
Sorry, the SimpleCov and then the RSpec spec models, are you saying those are two different ways to test to check coverage, or that's just the way we use SimpleCov in Rails?
Right. So I think this will be easier to see once we've kind of demonstrated it. But the thing I wanted to mention today, because it's very easy to forget and I want to start mentioning it early, is when you run RSpec, that will, if you just run RSpec, that will run all of your tests. And if you have SimpleCov installed, it'll give you back like a little percentage. It'll say, you know, so many examples, 99% coverage or something like that. The thing is, if you just run RSpec and rely on that SimpleCov number that comes back, or even this coverage HTML file, if you open this after just running RSpec by itself, it will only reflect the feature test coverage. And we'll be talking about feature tests in another lesson. But if you run it RSpec, sorry, my writing is terrible, but if you run RSpec spec models, then the coverage file will reflect your model tests specifically.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, glad that cleared it up. No problem. All right, so this is just a little bit of introductory content to keep in mind as you're learning about model tests. Don't feel any need to necessarily memorize this all today. I just kind of wanted to mention some of these things and get through the slide content that I have before jumping into an example. But what we'll be spending most of today actually doing, if I could get my screen to respond, is basically working through this lesson plan that's linked in the calendar. And I will demonstrate setting up a basic model test in Task Manager. So I will give everybody, like, let's say a minute or two to go ahead and get your Task Manager from the intermission work pulled up so that you're ready to follow along. I will try not to go too fast, but if you miss something or if I'm going too fast for you to follow along in your app, that's okay. I'll do my best to save some time so that we can have some time to address any questions that come up during this process. So I'll give everyone a second to get their Task Manager ready to go. Oops, sorry about that. And if you're following along with the lesson plan, we're going to start by setting up our RSpec and SimpleCov gems, because that's likely something you do not have in your Task Manager app thus far. So if people could give me a hand raise reaction once you have Task Manager pulled up and you're ready for us to get started and kind of go through this demonstration, that would be great. I don't want to leave too many people too far behind. Great, thanks people. Thank you, thank you. All right. Oh, I thought I could lower all your hands at once, but I don't remember how to do that. So feel free to go ahead and lower your hands. Again, if you don't get through all of this by the end of the hour today, that's all right. This is mostly just introducing and building on the RSpec, introducing model tests and building on the RSpec knowledge you already have. So what we're going to do is start by adding these gems to the gem file, specifically in the development and test group, like the lesson plan says. We're going to need RSpec Rails, we're going to need Pry, and we're going to need SimpleCov. So I'm going to hop over to my Atom and do that. Gem RSpec Rails, I believe that is, and then gem Pry and gem SimpleCov. Double check my syntax really quickly here. Pretty sure that's all we need. The next step, anytime we add anything to our gem file, the next step is always to run bundle install. You can also just run bundle without the install. Just running bundle is an alias for bundle install. And what this is saying is, hey, gem file, go install all of the gems I have listed, install it for this project. So I'll hop over to my terminal now and say bundle install. And we should get this green output. This may take a little bit longer on your end if you haven't installed these gems before. I already had them installed here in this directory, and I took them out and bundled and then put them back in and bundled. So it probably went pretty fast. But once that's complete, for RSpec, we actually need to run another Rails command from the command line. We need to run Rails G RSpec :install. And what that will do is it will generate some files for us that we'll be using with RSpec. This may feel familiar if you did this command and did some similar RSpec setup in mod 1. But just as a little bit of a recap or a refresher, it'll give us this RSpec file, which we won't really need to touch as far as I know. It'll give us a spec directory and a couple of these helpers where we will be adding a little bit more configuration. So I'm going to go over to my command line and run this command railsg rspec:install. That should get me all set up with those, those folders and files. So the config that we'll need for Rails, I think when you were using SimpleCov in Ruby, you probably put this in spec helper, but Rails helper is where we're going to put it this time. I believe spec helper is required in Rails helper. So we're just going to take these two lines, require SimpleCov and SimpleCov.start, and we'll add them to the very top of the Rails helper. I'm just going to copy and paste these. Yes. Okay. Matt, you have a question?
Yes, I made it all the way through the tutorial using Rails, yet adding these requirements and running the railsg rspec install command gave me that Rails is not currently installed on this system. And
okay.
I'm not sure why I'm getting that specific error because I didn't actually make any changes on my system since the tutorial was done.
Okay. And when you added those gems and ran bundle install, is that when you started getting that error, or did it bundle okay?
I did run bundle install after adding the gems, yes.
Okay. And no error output there, right?
No errors. It said at the very end of it that it said fetching RSpec Rails, installing RSpec Rails, bundle complete.
Okay. Like I said, I'm going to try to set aside some time to work through any weird issues that come up. So I will try to get back to you with that. But another thing worth checking might be to check your Rails version and make sure the one that you expect to be installed is installed.
I did check the Rails version. It also said the same error that it's not installed on the system.
Interesting. Okay, let's definitely circle back and remind me if I forget. Definitely raise your hand when we get through the rest of the tutorial, and we'll see if we can get that figured out for you.
Thanks.
No problem. Okay. Let's see. We'll add a line for coverage to the gitignore so that SimpleCov reports aren't pushed to GitHub. This is something that you'll want to do for your projects and stuff, but I'm not going to be pushing anything to GitHub for today's lesson, so I'm just going to skip this step for the sake of time. Okay, so let's see. The next thing that we're going to need to do is make a directory for our model tests. So that'll be here in the command line. We'll say make dir spec models. And the naming here is important. I mentioned earlier that in Rails, there are a lot of conventions that we follow. And the reason for this is that, with a Rails project, with a big framework like this, we're adding all kinds of files. They're all working in conjunction with one another. And Rails just relies on conventions to get things done. So when we have a directory, this is an example of one of these conventions. When we have a directory underneath the spec directory named models, our spec will infer from that setup that everything inside of this directory is a model spec, and it will run the spec slightly differently. We don't need to get into the details of how or why, but our spec will treat it slightly differently because it knows it's the model test. It's a model test specifically if it lives in this directory. Great. So let me make sure that I'm going in the steps that the lesson plan says. Yes, so then we'll actually be creating a spec file inside of that directory. So that'll be something like touch spec models task spec.rb. You may remember this from RSpec and mod 1, but it's important to have the _spec.rb in the name of your file or the test won't run. And we are just going to call this file, we're going to name it after the model that we're testing. So in our case, task. So touch spec models task spec should add this file inside of our models directory, and it does. Okay, I want to pause here and see if anybody else has questions up until this point or has run into any issues. Any questions so far? Okay. Great. So the very first thing that we'll need to add to all of our test files is require spec helper. We'll need to require that. Like that. And then we'll open up an outer RSpec describe block by saying RSpec describe. And instead of passing it a string here, I'm just going to give it the constant or the name of the model task. That's starts with an uppercase letter and it matches the name of the model that we have in our project. I have the option here to say, I think it's type model before opening up the do and the end block. But like I said, RSpec will infer that because of the way that we have our directory set up. So this is optional. I'm going to go ahead and remove it just to keep things simple here. And here's where we basically started our file and our, we've started our test file and we have everything that we need to start thinking about the actual test that we want to write. And let's see. Yes, Caroline.
The example shows require Rails helper versus
right.
spec helper. Is that different?
Nope, you're right. I just thank you for pointing that out. It's Rails helper. Taylor.
Yeah, similar question. It looks like that file's a directory level up. Do we have to worry about that syntax, or does RSpec automatically know where that file is just based on how the suite is run?
Let me make sure that my file tree is set up the way I think it is and that I understand your question. So we have a spec folder that was generated when we ran that RSpec install command. Then we created our models directory, and then we put our task spec inside of that models directory. Is that what I have going on here? We have spec, models, and then task spec. I'm sorry, Taylor, could you repeat your question?
So if you go back to Adam real quick, I would think that we would need like a .. slash in front of Rails helper to go a directory level up, but I wasn't sure if that was like something unique to RSpec here and it automatically knows where that file is, but just the directory structure didn't seem correct. And I was just curious on that.
Good question. As far as I know, we'll see if we run RSpec and get any errors here. It could be that there's a typo in the lesson plan, but Rails does make it a lot easier and more seamless to require files when we need to. And in many cases, we won't need to require files at all the same way that we did in Ruby. So I think this should be okay because RSpec and Rails kind of have some magic under the hood to know what we mean here, but that will be something that we'll keep, like, thank you for pointing that out, because if we get errors when we run RSpec, that could be something to revisit.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, generally, a lot of the pain of requiring files and pulling things into where you're working from writing in plain Ruby, that is not nearly as much of an issue in Rails because of the conventions that it expects us to follow. Okay, let's see. Any other questions before I move on? All right. So I think before I do anything else, what I'm going to do is go ahead and just run RSpec to see if there are any issues with the way we have this set up. And also to see what we get out or what we get spit back at us. And I think with this, with all this ugly output, if this is something that you're getting, you can try the gem cleanup gem option here. That's safe to run. Another thing you might want to look into trying is prepending your command with bundle exec and then running RSpec. Bundle exec is a command that will tell you, basically indicate that you want to run things from the version that the gem file specifies in this project directory. It will clean up a lot of the errors that you might get if you just run something like RSpec and you get these warnings or errors or things like that. It's just a little thing to keep in mind. We can get into more detail about why that works differently later on. But yeah, if you're getting a bunch of weird warnings or error messages, you can always add bundle exec to the beginning of your command. All right. Let's see, bundle exec RSpec, the output that we get is 0 examples, 0 failures. That makes a lot of sense. We haven't written any tests yet. So in the spirit of doing this and TDDing this, we we need to actually think of something that we're going to test. And when we look at our app directory and go down here into our models directory, we have our task model. And this is what we're writing a model test for. Sorry, just trying to rearrange this a little bit. And you'll notice that we don't actually have any custom behavior defined in our task model. We don't have any methods that we've written or anything like that. So this is going to be true TDD. I think what I want to do is, and I'm just going to write out some pseudocode here. I want to create a method, and specifically I want to create an instance method. And I want it to return true if the task title is laundry. So basically we'll be creating a method that will say yes or no if this is a laundry task, and I'm going to call it laundry. But I'm not going to write that implementation code yet because really we want to be TDDing. So the next step in our TDD process for this model test would be to use a describe block to indicate that we're writing some tests for instance methods specifically. So I'm going to do this by saying instance methods and then open another block. So anything nested in this block would be a test for an instance method. And then as we move through the mod, you will see that we'll have other blocks like class methods. And we could also describe relationships. I mentioned that briefly in the slides. We could describe validations. And this is all, these are tests we're not going to worry about right now, but just to kind of demonstrate, the point here would be to organize our tests a little bit better and make them more readable to the human eye. Marla.
Yeah, so I'm just guessing from this that a lot of the testing we did in mod 1 with like, oh, it exists or it has attributes and stuff like that, is that not really something we worry about with Rails?
Gotcha. Yes, I would say that's a good guess, and you're right. There are a lot of things that we don't actually need to test ourselves. And the reason for that is that, well, does anybody have a guess about why? Looking at the task class over here, just, yeah, curious if anybody has ideas.
I mean, I was just going to say that it's inheriting from application record, which when I think I looked into is inheriting from active record.
Yeah, exactly. So this behavior, like making sure that it exists, that it can create an instance of itself, some of the things that you wrote using the task model in the controllers, for example, that's behavior that we're inheriting from application record, which is a part of the active record gem. And the active record gem comes with Rails. So this should already be tested by the people who maintain active record, by the people who maintain Rails, Ruby on Rails. So we don't need to write extra tests for that. We can trust that it is well tested, and we'll be writing tests for the behavior that we're introducing.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Brian.
Just a short one about, I guess, RSpec naming conventions, where you get into like context and things like that. Are we typically just going to be used to describe straight through, or I guess I never really understood the difference.
Yeah, functionally, as far as I know, describe and context are exactly the same. They do the same thing. And at the places where I've worked, the convention has typically been just for readability, and context has had to do with like different scenarios. And it's tricky because scenario is also a word like describe and context that you can use in RSpec. But at my company where I worked before Turing, we used context to say, or describe would be more about like what the method should do, like describe laundry. And then context would be maybe if there was a different type of user accessing that method. So context as an admin, context as a guest. That's not a hard and fast rule. I think every team is probably a little bit different. And I would say if you're interested in RSpec and that can be like an eternal rabbit hole. You could find so many different conventions and ways of organizing your tests, and that's fine. But you can also just stick with describe for mod 2. They're functionally the same.
Okay, great, thanks.
Sure. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and move on and say describe, and then this will be the name of my method, and I'm going to give it a octothorpe or a pound sign or whatever because it's an instance method. I believe I tend to get these confused, so you all can call me out at any point, but I just checked my notes, and this is for instance methods. You can also use a : or a dot. Those would be for class methods. So that would be something we would use down here in this block, but we don't need to worry about that right now. For the time being, I'm just going to put this and then the name of my method, which is laundry. And now I'm ready to write the test for the behavior that I want. And the behavior that I want is, here's where I'm going to open up my if block and say it returns true if the task title is laundry. And just to be extra clear, I'm going to wrap this in double quotes so that I can wrap laundry in single quotes. And this is the first test we're going to be writing. Cool. So in order to call this method in my test, I need an instance of a task. So what I'll do is I'll set up a local variable and say task.create with a bang. We can get back to why I'm using a bang with the create in a minute, but for now, I'll just say that it's good practice in your tests to use bang with create and update. And I'm going to give it a title, and I want this to literally just be laundry, because what I want to test right now is that the method will return true for a title of laundry. Description, we don't need to worry too much about what this is. We're not testing that behavior, so I'm just going to say clean the clothes. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see what we're doing. Okay. All right, so now I can write my expectation, and I'm going to say expect task.laundry to be true. Yeah, essentially saying, hey, I have this instance of a task. It's this object that I set up on line 7. I'm calling this instance method of laundry, and it should return true because the title is literally just laundry. And now let's see what happens if I run my test. I forgot to use bundle exec, I'm sorry, y'all, but it should work the same. So here we get undefined method laundry for this task instance. That's what we would expect because we haven't made the method, right? So now that I have run my test, I've seen it fail, as is good practice in TDD. I can come over here and write my implementation code. So I'm going to say def laundry. And the logic here right now for the behavior that I'm testing would just be if title is exactly equal to the string laundry, or I can just say true. It's an explicit return. And now I'm going to run my test again. And I get one example, 0 failures. So that test passed. Now, I would like to demonstrate something. We have what it should return if this case is true, but otherwise, I think I want it to return false. And now if I run my test, I'm going to bundle exec this. Give me a second, y'all. And then if I say open coverage index HTML, this opens up my simple coverage file. And you can see that line 8 is not covered. I don't have a test for this. So I have not fully tested the behavior that I've defined in my model. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'll start another it block here. And this is part of the same, it's testing behavior for the same method, but it's a separate test in my mind. So I'm going to go ahead and make that a new it block. It returns false if the task title is not laundry. I'm going to go a little bit quicker here. I'm going to copy a little bit of this just to try to get this done. And I'll say this is groceries. I'll make the description match that. And then I'll expect task to be false. And actually, let me go ahead and really TDD this by getting rid of that else false implementation code in the task model. And I'll run this test and I hope that this fails, which it does. It says that it's returning nil. It's not returning false because I took that condition out of this method. So I'm going to put that back and run my test again. And I expect everything to be passing. And there we go. We've written a model test. All right. Any questions before we take a palm? Brian, I see your hand up. Is that a different question or from the? Okay. What questions do y'all have so far? Great. Well, let's take a palm and come back at 1:36. All right, folks, as you are coming back, can I get either a camera or a Slack emoji reaction to know that you're back? Please and thank you. People, cool, cool, cool. All right. I'm going to share my screen again and send you all off with an activity. So if you scroll down in the lesson plan, and what I'll do, just to let you all know, basically the rest of this hour, I'd like people to work as far as they can through this practice section of the lesson plan. But while most of you or some of you are doing that, I will also be taking questions and helping troubleshoot any environment issues, et cetera. So we'll kind of multitask there. But if you're ready to move on and get more practice with this, just scroll down to the practice section of the model testing lesson and look at these conditions here. Basically, what we have already written, we didn't write this test with the description exactly. We wrote basically the returns true when the title is laundry. But there are a few other conditions here. It returns true when the title contains the word laundry. It is case insensitive when checking if the title contains the word laundry, etc. So go ahead and see if you can write these tests and also the implementation code to make them pass for this laundry method that we just walked through in the example. Any questions about what I'm asking you all to do? Great. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. So if you need to find these, again, they're in the lesson plan, which is linked in the calendar. And could I get a hand raise reaction for those of you who had like an environment issue that prevented you from working through this example? We can go ahead and take a look at that now while others are working on the practice problems. Sorry, I forget. Was it Matt? Did you have that RSpec issue? Could we take a look?
I did, and I was able to resolve it by reloading my editor.
Oh, great.
I guess it was the integrated terminal that wasn't actually working well with me, and just a reloading of the terminal was what I needed.
That's great. Oldest answer in tech. Have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again? Glad that worked out for you.
No kidding.
Any other questions that we can address before I send everybody out on this activity? Cool. Well, let's spend the next 20 minutes or so working on that, but I'll just be here and go ahead and raise your hand if you do have any questions that come up and we'll take a look together. Everybody take about 5 more minutes to finish up what you're doing. If there are any outstanding questions that you want to jot down in a journal or the Code Help channel, this would be a great time to do that. We'll take a 5-minute POM at 1:55 before we jump into the project kickoff. So about 5 more minutes to wrap everything up that you're working on. All right, just letting you all know that's all I have for model testing today, but of course, happy to field any follow-up questions that come up in Slack. I'm going to go ahead and take a 5-minute palm and see you back here for the project kickoff after that.